Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on a journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jan Vermut, and joining me as always, my co-hosts Jonathan Edwards and Scott Burson. Today, we'll dive into one of the biggest problems that startups face, and I would expand this to teams in general, each other. We are joined by Martin Gonzalez, one of the authors of the book, The Bonfire Moment, that I really can recommend. And we'll focus on that book today. Martin created Google's Effective Founders Program, and Josh is a co-founder of the Google for Startups Accelerator. They both have impressive careers, and I'll just pick a few highlights of Martin's. Josh couldn't join us for today's session. But in 2023, Martin, for example, he got recognized by the Aspen Institute as a First Movers Fellow. And I think it's this year, right, that you won the Thinkers 50 Radar Award. That's 2024. Yeah, that's this year. Previously, you worked at BCG and Johnson & Johnson before you joined Google. So I'm really excited about this. Teams and people is always a problem that I love diving into. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So let's jump in. I mean, I think we're living in a world that is more and more oriented around technology and solutions like ever before. And everything seems to be around AI and all that kind of thing. Yet the title of your introduction is Teams Are Harder Than Tech. What on earth can you say that? How can you? It sounds like the world is telling us, no, it's tech that we should be focusing on.
So tech is definitely more exciting than people issues, to be clear. But a lot of our work with founders really anchors on this classic study out of Harvard that's been replicated, actually, where they asked VCs, think of the companies in your portfolio that had recently failed and what were the top reasons for failure. The number one reason for failure, 65% of startups failed because of people issues. Not tech, not funding, not market timing. It was the people. It was co-founder conflict. It was not getting the right skill sets on the table. It's not addressing that toxic work culture. And to your point, like we are in a really interesting evolution of tech at the moment. Will that change the physics or the equations of what it takes to succeed? It could, if you can imagine what Sam Altman is calling like the one-person billion-dollar company. If one day you just remove all the people and just have one person, then sure, all the people problems go away. I think we're far from that.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
semi-jokingly, depends on the day, but I sometimes say, wouldn't it be great if it works without customers and without employees? Like that would be,
That's right.
but probably we're stuck with people anyways. Yeah.
That would be
But
the easiest and worst business ever, right?
right.
No employees, no customers.
So maybe I have a little bit of a strong hypothesis, but it just, I was thinking about it. I feel like in somehow in tech, I feel like we have a long history of knowing about tools. We know kind of more or less, at least, how we deal with tech problems. But it feels like this is lacking somehow on the people side, or is that too much of a black and white?
Um, there's actually a lot. I think the issue is not a lack of knowledge. I think the issue is a lack of attention to the problem.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I think there's I think there's an incredible field of like organization behavior and organizational psychology that has really looked deeply into these spaces. I find that when I work with these maverick innovators, really what they care about is, can I build a really amazing product that will disrupt industries?
Yeah.
And they obsess over it, as they should. And then they never like when they get started, they never think, okay, I wanna start a company so I can manage people. That's never the aspiration. And so they never spend enough time. And so part of what led to the book was actually this very no frills workshop we built about almost 10 years ago now. It would make any of my peers in the world of organizational psychology like think, oh, there's nothing special here. And truly there was nothing special about it. But the founders that participated in this 1 day structured time where they could really think about what is the hardest, the most emotionally charged part of the journey,
Yeah.
They found it to be the most useful part of the accelerator program next to like learning about machine learning and design thinking and marketing and sales. And so somehow there's one like just not enough time spent thinking about these issues and giving people the tools to solve it. And then two, just I think it's just not the most exciting part of it's not something you would put on LinkedIn or you tweet about. Like
Yeah.
it's something you try to solve behind closed doors so people don't know that there's a problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I like that you mentioned so the book is called The Bonfire Moment, but it's I mean, yes, there is a moment, but it's like a whole concept of a workshop or of a
Yeah,
day-long workshop. So can you
yeah,
give a little, you hinted at it, can you give us a little bit of an insight in how did it come about? What does, like, in general the workshop look like?
yeah. So this workshop, as I mentioned, started about 9 years ago. We actually piloted it in Jakarta.
Yeah.
I was living in Singapore back then. I asked Josh, I said, "Hey, look at this research from Harvard, which is the study I cited earlier. Like we should just try to do something." And Josh was at that time based here in Silicon Valley, building the accelerator program. And I said, we need something on people and culture. Let's just try something. And we tried it in Jakarta, and it gets rated the highest across all the different workshops in this accelerator. And we're thinking, okay, there's
There's
an
something there.
anomaly. Well, no, actually, we
Oh,
approach it with a lot of skepticism. We're like, surely there was something, I don't know, in the food or with a specific cohort. Like, let's try it again. So we tried again in Bangalore, and again it gets rated the highest, most useful part of it. And then we bring it to Sao Paulo, to Warsaw, basically. And at some point, it reaches about founders in about 70 countries. We have like a few dozen facilitators around the world running it. Where I think it really, so there were two moments where we realized, okay, maybe we need to write this up in a book. So one was when we go back to Sao Paulo after bringing the program there. A year after, a few founders who we write up in the book actually come to us and say, "Martin, I hope you don't mind. Like when we attended that workshop last year, it was so useful, and I took pictures of your slides. I created my little like bootleg version of it, and I ran it with all these startup teams. And I thought, well, why are you ashamed? Like that's actually amazing. Like, and maybe
yeah.
we should just help you. Like, look, like here's the deck." And we should make the tools available freely to everyone to use because really, we care mostly about getting the word out and helping teams. That was the first one. The second one was when we brought the program for the first time to Johannesburg. And one of the founders was so taken by the content because at this point we had tailored it to what we knew about the startups. Early on, it was just our best guess on what could be useful. Over time, we really tailored it to all the data, around the data we collected on them. And one of the founders said, "Hey, where's the book that captures all of this? Because I'd love to take it home and share it with other people." So it was around that time where we thought, okay, we need to take this seriously. Josh actually initially thought we should write a book, and I thought, look, there's nothing special here.
Yeah.
We should like I don't and for a very long time he was saying, just speak to this one author, speak to this editorial consultant. And he was warming me up to the idea. And
He
I
had to
think when we
convince you.
no, truly. No, I'll tell you why, Jan. In my field of leadership development, you need to have gray hair and be hard of hearing before you are credible enough to write a book. And I thought,
Yeah.
that's going to be a while for me. So it took a lot of convincing from Josh, who had the initial vision, to actually put pen to paper.
Yeah. And I want to emphasize this. So in the book, honestly, like there is a whole set. I mean, you really get the tools. There is a lot of detailed information of how to run the workshop. Like
Yeah,
there's tips on how to facilitate it and all that. And there's all the templates. It's, I mean, honestly, it's like I feel like you can get the book, and of course, experience helps, but you're more or less ready to go. It's
it,
really,
yeah.
there's very little I think that you, I mean, yeah, that you're holding back.
Yeah, and our vision for it was, can we open source this workshop and make it as available as possible for as cheaply as possible? The book does two things, right? The first part of the book, we talk about all the patterns and all that we've seen from our research on these founders. Because over time, as we reached founders in these 70 countries, we were collecting data on them, and so we talk about the patterns that we've seen. And then part two basically gives you a DIY guide to do this
Yeah.
yourself. It open sources all the tools. Um, the inspiration was really the design thinking movement that happened maybe about 8, 10 years ago. Jake Knapp, who wrote the book called Sprint, was actually a mentor of ours, and that was the template. It was like, can we
Mm.
create a DIY experience? A sprint is 5 days. This one is one day. Make it so easy to follow, that people can then just, and we know that especially for the startup world, startups love to DIY everything. As you know, like these
Yeah,
founders turned around and did their own version of our workshop. So we figured, perhaps they'll pick this up.
yeah, yeah. Usually they have the problem like almost no one else, but no money. So that's the
That's right. That's right.
so
Exactly.
I want to get a little bit into what are these kinds of problems. So I feel like maybe I have this wrong, but in my mind, I feel like there is at least a distinction between there's problems within the team, and then what I see quite often is problems with leadership. So leadership in brackets versus the team. So
Yeah.
in other words, bad leadership in some way or another. But could you
Yeah.
give us maybe that's even wrong to start with, but could you give us a little bit of an insight? What are some of the typical tensions and problems that they
Yeah.
that they face?
So in the book, we talk about four traps, and maybe it's worth talking about each one in turn. So the first one is a trap of speed.
Yeah.
And the idea behind a trap of speed is when you have really ambitious goals under really tight constraints, i.e., you're a startup. By the way, like this is many teams within large companies as well. Big
Yes.
goals, not a lot of resources to complete those goals. um, Something very predictable happens, which is you optimize for the short game at the risk of winning the long game. You focus on that task list, that deadline, the fundraising, the product launch, and then you deprioritize things like, are we getting the right people and skill sets into the team? Are we addressing that kind of toxic behavior that, is easy to sweep under the rug for now? Let's deal with it later. We talk in that chapter about this idea that behavioral scientists have known for a while now called hyperbolic discounting,
Yes.
which is we apply a discount factor to things that benefit us into the future. And it's not procrastination, it's actually a computational error we have, which is because it's coming into the future, I somehow devalue it a lot more than things that benefit me today.
Yeah.
And as a result, we see a lot of toxic like team environments really build in very small ways very early on, and it takes a lot of time for it to then become a really big issue. But by the time it becomes a big issue, you have like an emergency on your hands. And so that's the first trap. It's how do we help founders anticipate and leaders anticipate some of these? Like you don't need to deal with all people issues. There are in the book what we
Yeah.
found to be 20 of the most painful challenges that leaders sweep under the rug, and they don't deal with it early on. It's things like, are we anchored on like a real problem set and a true meaningful goal that matters to the people in this team? Um, do have we talked about how we spend our limited funding? If one of us doesn't scale fast enough for the business, like what's an appropriate way to actually talk about
Yeah.
that and maybe offboard you from the team? So it's all these, delicate issues that are easier talked about before they happen, a lot harder when it's kind of in the present.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. It's on the trap of, and I'll go faster on the other three, and then we can dig in if there's interest. But the second one is the trap of the inner circle,
Yeah.
specific to startups, and you'll see this even in corporate teams. A lot of startups will co-found with friends and family. It's the most expedient thing to do, but we know from the data that those are the most unstable partnerships.
I can
Um,
imagine.
and part of it is because those relationships are so expensive. You not only have a professional relationship, but on top of that, you have a personal relationship. So if in a moment where I have to put the business at risk, or I'd have to put my relationship at risk to serve the goals of the business, guess what? If it's an expensive relationship, the chances I would do that are so much less.
Yeah.
And so we talk about how, these inner circles are so naturally formed in these teams, and they tend to then be repellent of disagreement. They tend to, suppress divergent thinking. We talk about how that becomes a really important skill to build. we talk about the trap of the maverick mindset, which is a lot of people will point their innovative mind, the same innovation instincts towards their products, and they point the same instincts towards people. And they forget that people evolve much more slowly than technology evolves. And so you're
Yeah.
dealing with actually very old hardware um, when you deal with people. And so we actually know quite a bit about how people operate and what they want from work. And we find that a lot of leaders will fall into the trap of trying to be too overly innovative around, certain management. Now,
Yeah.
I think we need to definitely fix the way management is performed in the world. I think we're not at the like we don't have all the answers, but I think there are certain things that we know to be true that we tell startups, please don't innovate on these things. For instance,
Yeah.
we know that at some point hierarchy becomes a very healthy part of growing a company. You might think it's cool and savvy and really great to not have hierarchy, but actually higher if you couple hierarchy with a large organization, you get chaos.
Yeah.
But people don't think about chaos as the outcome of that. So that, and there are a few others that we talk about in that chapter. The last thing, real quick, is the trap of confidence. And we find that when you have these big goals, you a feature that is almost necessary at the start of any big journey is overconfidence. Founders are overconfident. Like this is
They have to be, right? In some
entrepreneurs
sense.
need to be overconfident to even get started. If we knew exactly the true cost of
Yeah.
building this, you would never begin. I mean, I would even ask you of this podcast. Like you probably, if you knew exactly what it would take to build a podcast like this, you probably wouldn't have started. So there's almost a requirement, a prerequisite to be overconfident. And then we know from the data that that overconfidence becomes almost exclusively a liability after those early days. And then we find actually that a lot of founders will experience a lot of self-doubt along the journey. And then they equate that as a signal of future failure. But it seems from our data that that moment of humility, that self-doubt, actually is a signal of growth.
Wow.
Um, and that becomes a big part of what we deal with
Yeah.
founders on.
Yeah. I really liked your point there on kind of the healthiness of some degree of hierarchy. So I feel like, I mean, I have some startup experience, but I think the biggest part of my experience in teams that I work with is in corporates. And sometimes, or quite often, you hear nowadays it's fancy to say we're democratic, we're flat hierarchies.
Yeah.
But in truth, of course, there's a hierarchy there. And I feel that's a
Yeah.
very toxic mix, right? So there is an informal
Yeah.
hierarchy and everybody pretends there is not. And I think that creates a lot of tension as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So first of all, I mean, that's such an interesting insight that there's almost the explicit what's on paper and what's actually
Yeah.
practiced. And when there's dissonance between those two, like that's even worse than if you just all said, look, there is hierarchy and this is it. Like that's almost a better, you
Yeah.
know, situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I there is a real appeal to these flat hierarchy type organizations. We all want to feel equal. There's an egalitarian instinct in all of us that, we're all equal. So surely my boss should not be treated better than I get treated. Um, and then when you look at the research, it just tells you. So one of the studies that I really enjoy talking about is a study by Ronnie Lee in Wharton. He looks at about, I believe, 900 gaming studios, and he tried to understand for the gaming studios that introduced a layer of hierarchy, um, what do you tend to see? And in that world, in the world of gaming, there's this general belief that the moment you put managers on there, like firstly, managers are evil.
Yeah.
And that when you put managers on there, then you create these artificial silos, and then you don't get the cross-pollination of ideas that make for really great games, right? So that's kind of the going in assumption. Well, he tested that with the data, and he found actually that a part of that was true. He found that when you added a layer of hierarchy, you would see a decrease in the quality or the creativity of the games as signaled by customer reviews at about 1%. For every layer of hierarchy, you get 1% less in terms of
Yeah.
customer reviews on creativity. And then he also found that for that additional layer of hierarchy, you also get a 14% increase in commercial achievement. Now you might say, okay, that like if you didn't get that 1% decrease, maybe maybe you get a much significant increase in commercial value. But like that's not a bad trade-off.
Yeah.
And what it speaks to is that when you have, and I underscore healthy, when I say healthy hierarchy, it underscores that, good managers can help reduce the kind of ambiguity that the team
Yeah.
needs to march in a single direction, right?
Yeah.
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 Well,
I really, really
it,
like
it
that.
could also be obviously that maybe companies that have hierarchy have maybe are maybe bigger or have there could be like some other explanation to that, of course. But I had a question for you regarding your thoughts about the how fluid do you believe hierarchies can be? I'm not an expert in this at all. For example, holacracy, this type of stuff.
Yeah.
I believe, I'm not sure that it's about having hierarchies that fluctuate depending on the project or something. Or I may be confusing
Yeah,
this.
like agile teams or even the Spotify model, which I think was made very popular by Spotify, obviously. Um, so so a couple of thoughts. One is I think the reason why we bring out our pitchforks against hierarchy is because we conflate hierarchy with bureaucracy. I think people think that hierarchy
Yeah.
equals bureaucracy when actually they do grow in tandem. They tend to grow together, but they don't have to. So you could have a healthy hierarchy and use those managerial layers to actually speed up certain processes, right? And so I think if you have managed that reduce bureaucracy and not create bureaucracy, and that's great. Um, how fluid should hierarchies be? I think I've seen some evidence that agile teaming could actually help reduce a lot of the waiting time and the slowness in getting products out the door. So there's definitely upside there. Um, but in terms of like how well does that scale? So that works really well in smaller companies. In fact, the Spotify model, which has been replicated in like banks and many other places, like that was actually created at a time when I believe they were 200 people in Spotify. And then they've deviated from that well
Yeah.
beyond that point, and yet people still talk about how great it is. Holacracy, one of the poster children of Holacracy is Tony Hsieh, the late Tony Hsieh of Zappos, and he introduces this
Yeah.
into Zappos. What I find really, so they lose a lot of employees in the process of rolling this out. People feel like, operationally they became a lot less sound as a company. What I find really ironic about that period of time was at some point Tony kind of makes an ultimatum to the entire company and say, you better get on board or you get out the door, which I thought ironically was such a display of power and hierarchy
Yeah.
for a move towards no hierarchy, right? So I think there's some value in there, but for bigger companies, I would be really careful to advise them to go fully in that direction. I think experimenting with these ideas in smaller pockets. So let's say you're building an innovation team and it's a team of 50 or 100, like that's a really great way to test some of these ideas. The moment you get really large, you risk chaos in the process.
Yeah. So I want to get into the kind of the weeds of the workshop, let's say, or the
Yeah.
that day. So I mean the four broad phases, and I really like how you named it. It starts with face hard truths. The
Yeah.
second one is notice hidden dynamics. Then I love this one. And then the third one is drop the masks, and then resolve unspoken issues. So
Yeah.
that's like the, how do you
The
call it,
arc. Yeah, if you
the
will.
arc? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I really like that it begins with truth, face hard
Yeah.
truth. That's the starting point where you need to get into. But somehow, like that sounds like the biggest challenge. Like
Yeah.
how do you create a space such that people are honest and open up and
Yeah.
really say the truth?
Yeah. So we talk about how this whole experience in the Bonfire Moment workshop is really about testing your theory of success. So a theory of success is I expect that if I did A, I will get B result. If I did these things, I will become successful. Um, and what I find in my work with all these leaders around the world is they sometimes are overconfident in their theory of success, and they don't slow down enough to really check and see, okay, is this actually the right way of operating? Um, I tell this really fun story in the book, actually, and I have this image by my desk here. I don't know if your listeners can see the video, but maybe I'll describe it real quick. It's a picture of
Yeah.
surgery that was happening in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And what's funny about this picture is you have a patient, and usually in this time there were surgical theaters,
Yeah.
like large open spaces where people can sit and observe while the surgery was happening in the center. And then you have these physicians, these surgeons, basically in their outside garments. So they come in presumably on a horse, and then they just walk in, wearing whatever they're wearing. They go about the surgery. The needles they will use to suture up wounds are kind of pinned on their lapels. If a bandage falls to the floor, they'll pick it up and just bandage it up. And it was a time where they thought, our success rates for surgery were so low. In fact, you had to prepay for your surgery before you go into the surgery, just because most of the time they die, right?
Yeah.
So it's all prepaid. And they were innovating on different methods, different, sophisticated tools, ways to go about the surgery. And then it took someone who was not in that field, it took a chemist by the name of Pasteur to say, actually, the reason why, you get infections, was because of these invisible germs. And he invented the germ theory. And then he basically revolutionizes so many industries, including surgery. And he says, actually, the way you increase your success rate is not by sophisticated tools, it's by actually having sanitary surroundings. So wash your hands. And all these solutions were not these were very simple solutions. So I ask founders, like, what is the germ theory that you're missing out on? And the
Yeah.
first part of the journey is really questioning how well. And so what we do in this first part of the workshop, Face Hard Truth, is we ask people to reflect and actually answer a very simple leadership questionnaire, around what we see from our research to be the most effective strategies that effective founders would deploy. And we have them self-reflect in some more elaborate versions of the workshop. We invite other people to provide feedback. Their co-founders, their employees. The corporate world will call this a 360-degree feedback survey. So it's not something we invented. But then what we do is we benchmark them across our data set of founders around the world and show, like, to what extent are how do you stack against, the most effective founders in our data set. And it becomes a moment, an eye-opening moment for a lot of leaders to see, okay, I have completely taken for granted that I needed to be doing this. And it helps them really question how they spend, their time and how they engage with other people. And that's the first, so we hit them, part of why I hesitated to call it the bonfire moment is I didn't want people to think this was going to be a warm and fuzzy, comfortable
It
experience. It's
sounds
actually
very, yeah.
the opposite of it, right? It's intense, it's in your face. So in my mind, we said this is a bonfire moment, not a campfire moment. This is like it's
Okay.
the raging fire of the bonfire that is the feeling that we get from this. So that's how we begin the day. And we're
Yeah.
just at 10 a.m. and they're already getting hard feedback on
And
I was
themselves.
just gonna say, like 9 a.m. when you get hit in the face with truth, like it's
Yeah.
usually that's not a nice.
I've got your facilitation handbook here, and I just want to read this as it starts. The facilitator sets the group's expectations by sharing an overview of the day and sets ground rules. No screens, no bullshit, no bragging, no spilling. I don't even know what spilling is, but I feel like if facilitator did that, I would sort of sit up a little in my seat and I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna behave. You've got my attention. That's great.
You,
What
you know,
what is spilling? What is spilling?
well, just that we would keep things confidential in the room.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
No, but the rule around no bragging and no bullshit is so particularly relevant for founders in the
Ah,
startup space. Whenever you go to startup ecosystem events, it's like it's like there's this tape that's on repeat
yeah.
where, oh, I've grown to X many thousand founders. I've expanded to this many countries. I have hired these many people. Like they're always on pitch mode, constantly on pitch mode. And then it sounds like everyone's crushing it. Um, and then when you look at the statistics, like most of them are gonna fail. So like what's the reality? So
Yeah.
then we want to create a space in these workshops where, okay, let's relax the pitch mode, the pitch instincts. In fact, we don't allow what I wanted to add to that list
Yeah.
is no VCs allowed, no investors allowed, because we know that there's a lot of BS that flows between founders and investors. It's just part of the game they need to play. And then let's get down to the real challenges, the painful parts of the journey, and that's what we spend the day on.
And what are the dimensions that the founders get feedback on? Is there a certain amount of dimensions?
Yeah, so the tool and we write this all up in the book, but also our website. You can actually go in and the self-assessment is completely free, so you can actually go in there and already see how you stack up against our data set. But it's things like we find that by far the most important factor is this idea of treating people like volunteers, which is if you assume that good people have options and they can walk out the door and that there's no place for disrespect and curtness in the workplace, like you will treat people very differently. And how do you then not just have a pitch deck, but how do you take your understanding of people's aspirations and shape the work around what they personally care about? So that's the first one. We talk about protecting people from distractions, protecting the team from distractions. We talk about how you want to minimize micromanagement. There are scenarios where micromanagement is actually very valuable, but what you want is to move into a space where you can lift up from the details and work on bigger challenges and delegate. We talk about making sure that expectations are clear. We talk about how you manage through disappointment, whether you're open about your weaknesses, that you are able to ask for help. So it's all these types of things.
Would you say so? So now I'm thinking about startups and also about corporates. Is this something like is it good for 10 people, 50 people? What would be a good size? So if is it on a team level? Is it just a leadership team? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So in writing up the DIY version in the book, we had to simplify significantly. So we wrote it up in a way that you should be able to run it with one intact team, where you have a team of whether it's 5 to 10 people. But we've run this with 100 people in the room, with multiple teams, multiple companies in the room, or within a single company with multiple teams in the room. And at that point, we would recommend that you get a facilitator who can, who can approach this with more kind of, I guess, professional skills, because it gets a lot more complex. But one thing that your listeners can look forward to in the book is we spend an entire chapter and we actually take them into a bonfire moment, where we write up a real story. Actually, we mask the names obviously because a lot of the problems are so are so difficult and painful to hear. But it's a team of 4. There's a facilitator in the room who's a mentor to them. Actually, inside story, that's actually me. I just mask also my name, but that's kind of how I would run it. And you can see actually just in narrative form, like how that day goes.
Yeah. And I really like, so by the way, in the user guide, you have this, I mean, you have a graphic on like how it feels, like how the day flow. You have I don't recall the expression now, but like you line out the dynamics, and so kind of I thought that was really helpful. Like because as a let's say as a user of the workshop, I think it's as a facilitator, it's good to know, like, you start somewhere, it will go down. There are some loops and hoops, but you will end up on a high note. So I think I thought that was really helpful as a facilitator, because I imagine if I would have to facilitate something like that, I would be super worried. Like it's because you're touching very sensitive topics.
Right. So what you're talking about is we map out kind of the emotional journey we've seen teams go through the day. So almost like an hour by hour.
Yeah.
And usually, like, you enter the day with a bit of openness, excitement because you're out of your co-working space, you're maybe in someone's living room. It's just a different environment, so there's openness. And the moment you hit people with feedback, or this realization that I'm not actually, doing it well, then suddenly there's a dip. And then there are parts of the day where we invite them to write up what we call a user guide, which is really
Yes.
a manual of like, why am I here? What will keep me motivated to do the startup? How do you give me feedback? How do I like to do my work, etc. Then you pick up the energy a little bit, and there's a sense of like, okay, I now have a better understanding of the people in the room. And then we get to part three, which is drop the masks, where we invite people into what we very affectionately call a bullshit circle, which
Yes.
is a chance for people to reflect on the biggest insecurities they bring to the work and what masks do we tend to wear to protect ourselves in the process. And then that's a whole different emotional kind of a different set of emotions as well. Like you feel a bit more vulnerable, a little bit more maybe naked in front of your colleagues, but also at the end of that process, you'll feel a lot more affirmed that you're not alone in your doubts, in your self-doubt.
Yeah.
So we plotted out because we want people who are running these workshops to be aware that this is so much more an emotional journey than it is an intellectual journey.
Yeah.
But you eventually exit this whole experience with a lot more understanding of one another, with feeling a lot more back in touch with the mission that you originally set out to do, and feeling ready for that next push. That's kind of the feeling that many people get out of the day.
I love these two points you touched on. So I think one idea that I want to sneak into my company is exactly the idea of user guides. Well, where you kind of describe like how should others deal with me, and then you also know how to deal with them, because
Yeah.
this is something usually we leave this. I mean, usually, well, often we leave this kind of to, well, you figure it out to chance. You figure it
Yeah.
out over
Yeah.
well, to that guy you have to talk in that way, and so and you're, but I love the idea that you can, well, we can sit down and we can make this explicit. We can talk about this. We can.
But
Yeah.
are people I mean, are they able to create a user guide for themselves? It doesn't seem like an easy thing
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah. So I think there are two elements to that question, Jonathan. So one is how do we so there's a difficulty of that specific task, and then how open do you think people are going to be in actually being truthful in writing up their user guide? So on the first part of what we do is we use structure as a way to make people feel, or to ease the process. So it's very simple questions that we ask them to do. There's some parts where we have them tick some boxes. So I think there's some training wheels that we kind of provide people, especially for people who aren't that self-aware, right? Like, how do you get the best work out of me? I don't know. This is my first year I'm still in college. Who knows? But we kind of give some, guidelines there. I think in terms of people's willingness to actually expose their preferences to their team. So we encourage people to do the bonfire moment as early in the journey as possible. At a time where maybe there's still a lot of goodwill. When you're at a point where the team is falling apart, and the story we do tell in the book is of a team that's pretty much distressed. But to be clear, like we don't want you to wait till that point. Then you risk people not actually being willing to do any of this, right? And so that's where a really good facilitator comes in, where in this chapter where I actually address this group of four. uh, it's very common for me to start the day by saying, look, I've spoken to each of you, and you all just want to quit. And it's so easy to think of quitting now that things are just so difficult. But I've also heard from each of you that you're willing to give it one last shot. And this is the day that we're just going to give it one last shot. So part of that means I'm going to take you through a few exercises that feel a little bit awkward, a little bit maybe stiff or contrived. But if you can just trust the process, like we're probably going to get something out of this. And I think a facilitator who can address a distressed team like that and become almost like the anchor of maybe hope and optimism, I think helps a lot.
Yeah.
I'd like to make an observation, Martin.
Yeah.
see what your thoughts are. It first, well, it seems like the root of your process is really to unearth some of these unspoken things, these articulated causes of stress that people have, and maybe even in the like your no bullshit rules or whatever. I imagine if I was there, well, first of all, if a founder starts talking about how great he is, all these things he's done, if I'm a member of the team, then I probably shrink back a little bit. I'm like, I don't feel like I don't feel like I should even say anything. I feel like, so whatever dynamics are going on, I'm gonna just clamp. I'm gonna be even less
Yeah.
willing to share. It seems like your process is really designed to just unearth everything, just to make everything, I think, transparent and to
Yeah.
shine light on things, which is why you start with the uncomfortable bit of it. I don't know. That's just sort of an observation. Is that
Yeah.
close?
So it absolutely, that's absolutely the design principle here. So when we started on and this is not, by the way, most leadership training programs. Most
Yeah.
leadership training programs will start with a nice soft like exercise, like let's kind of get to know each other. Let's
Yeah.
Breaking the ice,
uh,
warm ups.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
break the eye. Like, and look, there's a time and place for that. I know that these startup teams are time starved
Yeah.
and they have actually high tolerance for intensity. So we match that in this workshop. But one of the questions that guided the design of this was the question of how do you help smart motivated people to grow? Like, what is that core mechanism of growth? Um, and I think the answer to that question for people who are smart and motivated, the answer to that question is just really good feedback. If you can put a mirror up to them, you don't even need to tell them how to solve it. You just need to highlight the problem areas really clearly, and smart, motivated people will rush in and figure out the right solution. It's almost a difference between, and this is credit to a wonderful colleague of mine, Shannon Mahan. Whenever we work, especially with engineers at Google, you cannot go in and pretend you have all the answers. In fact, they will
Yes.
show you the door. Instead, the paradigm I've adopted, thanks to Shannon, is I think of the work as giving them a Rubik's Cube and sitting next to them and guiding them through the process of solving the Rubik's Cube. They need to solve it um, because they know their business best, they know their team best, they know themselves best. But how do you create a space where it's about Rubik's Cube solving and not offering frameworks and solutions? That's the paradigm.
And so what in is good feedback then? Do you frame this in your workshops? Do you tell them how to give feedback, or do people
Yeah.
just say what's on their minds?
So it's absolutely a structured kind of process. So first of all, the self-reflection we invite them to, that's a structured process. We ask them to consider certain factors. The user guide, again, a structured process. Um, in the bullshit circle, we invite them to consider a very simple framework that says, in our observation of people under these kinds of startup-like pressures, we find that they tend to wear one of three masks or a combination of these three masks. It's either optimism, strength, or detachment. Either you show extra helpfulness and positivity to paper over the difficulties, or you show prestige and intellectual prowess to say, look, we're going to succeed here. That's strength. Or detachment, which is, I want to show calm and independence. I want to be incognito, out of the limelight. That's my way of coping. And we invite people to consider, okay, is it optimism, is it strength, or is it detachment? And I think some of those handholds become useful for people who maybe aren't so aware of their masks to think, okay, it's probably A and B or A and C or all of the above, right? And so I think some of that helps in the process of providing that um, feedback or receiving some of that feedback. Yeah.
So what would you say? Like, I mean, if the listeners who are out there they are in teams, and I'll bet all my money that they all experience team issues. So what would you say is like is the bonfire moment something for everyone, or are there like signs where you could say, okay, maybe it would be a good time that we start that process and that kind of thinking?
Yeah. So, I typically like to say that the bonfire moment is only really relevant when you have teams that have really big ambitions and under tight constraints, whether it's time or resources. If that's not you, if you're in a team that kind of has the luxury of time and resources or is not particularly working on anything ambitious, I find that I worry that this will feel a bit like a waste of time, which I think is a minority of teams, by the way. I think a lot of teams are trying to work on big goals.
Yeah.
And then I like to say that within 6 months of forming the team, it would be so healthy for them to go through this process. Um, and by the way, like the moment the leader changes or new team members come on board or the strategy or the goals of the team change, like that is a new team, even if it's the same people, but if it's different goals or strategies, like that's definitely a new team, and you might consider doing it then. Um, if you are in a very distressed time of a team's life where things are just not working out, there's a lot of conflict, that would also be like you're too late, first of all, but secondly, like you should just do it at that point in time and not wait. Do it with urgency because I think this could really help. This becomes like a nice release valve. It could help
Yeah.
kind of overcome some of these challenges.
Now, there's some teams that can't be helped, that
So
they're not going to succeed.
So when people ask me, what are the signals of success of this program? The one thing I sometimes say, which is a little bit controversial to say, is sometimes success actually is that the team decides to walk away and walk away from each other. I think what this can sometimes surface is that certain differences are just like insurmountable, or that we've just discovered we don't have enough energy to keep going with the cast of characters or with the roadmap that's ahead of us. That's not an entirely bad thing. Like from an investor standpoint, that is efficient use of capital. If this is gonna die eventually, we might as well kill it now, and then we can move on and point our capital to something else, and point the energies of these smart people to other problem sets, and then those things could succeed, right?
Yeah, it's so valuable. I think this question of when should you continue or stop is one of the hardest questions when you're trying to build a business, and it's extremely difficult to answer that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is
Very
true.
valuable. And not
Yeah,
always
this
good
is
to
true.
to go on too long. Yeah.
And in corporate team, I mean, I sometimes I experience this. Well, I realized it later on. So as a consultant, you need to get an idea of the team dynamics anyway. Whatever you do, it's something you need to work with. But I had teams where I realized like 6 out of the 8 they have quit. But they're here physically, but they have quit, right? So and then there's really the question is at one point in time you have, okay, I can put in some energy, but it's not gonna, whatever I do, it's not gonna do anything because the team it's already right. Scott, probably.
Well, yeah. One reason I was asking Martin that question is I'm reminded there was an old model of team dynamics. It was like the forming, storming, norming, and performing. You familiar with that, Martin?
Yeah.
It's
a good one.
An old model, but essentially, the team has to go through a certain amount of turmoil, but essentially, as the personalities learn to work with each other, and that had by and large been my experience, following those patterns. But there's a particular team that I can think of where it just would not leave the storming period. It's just like, I mean, I'm talking like years go by, and my personal assessment of that was, it really just a single person can sort of hold the entire team, almost what I'm trying to say, as a captive, and can a single individual can, for whatever personal failings, whatever, doesn't grow, doesn't whatever, and can hold the whole team, can keep the whole team back. And I don't know if you have a solution to that, other than maybe the solution is sometimes the team numbers need to change. That was sort of what was in the back of my mind when I was asking you if some teams are beyond help. Now, most teams seem like they do resolve, but I have there's one that it just never did. And honestly, I think there was one person that just sort of refused to grow, and therefore
Yeah.
everybody was sort of captive.
So it's an easy problem to solve if that person was not the leader of that team.
Sure.
It's much harder if they were the leader of that team.
Sure. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They're the boss. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So Martin, okay, we've talked about a lot of the workshop and all the elements. If somebody is out there and think, hey, it sounds like this is something for me, where would you point them to? How can they start? What was a good place to go to?
Great. Well, the book is a good first place to go to. The bonfiremoment.com or thebonfiremoment.com, either one works. You'll see also there a few videos on what the day looks like, tools that they can access. At some point, we will have a certification program, so we'll have a few certified facilitators to come and help around the world. And we're active on LinkedIn, Josh and I, so feel free to reach out there too.
Great. So Martin, thank you so much. I can honestly recommend the book. It's extremely hands-on. So it's like, I mean, sometimes books say this on the cover and then you buy it and then it's something else. But here you really get a honestly like an hour by hour transcript of how the workshop is like. So I really recommend it. Martin, is there anything else you wanna share that we need to touch upon before we
just a lot of gratitude for you all, and we just learned recently that the book is now technically an international bestseller, so we've been very pleased with the reception of it. And look, like, bestseller lists were not the main goal of why we wrote this book, but we do want to get it out to as many people as possible. So I'm grateful for this podcast for helping.
Congratulations.
Thanks for being on. Yeah. I think you hit a problem there. So
yeah.
The problem is certainly there.
Yeah.
Right. So that concludes today's Product Quest podcast. As always, please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and see you next time. Great. Thanks so much.
Great to meet all three of you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.